In our study today of the book of Second Timothy, we're drawing to a close in Paul's final letter to his friend, his apprentice, and more importantly, his son in the faith, Timothy. And the closing of Second Timothy is not surprisingly sad. Paul is in a prison, a Roman prison, awaiting what he knows is his inevitable death. And he spent these two letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, encouraging his young son in the faith to remain faithful to the Word of God, to remain faithful to it in his own personal life, where he's encouraged Timothy to his personal godliness, and to let no one despise his youth, but to be an example. And he's encouraged Timothy in his proclamation of that godliness, to preach the word, to not be sidetracked by false doctrine, to not be sidetracked by really a waste of time and endless genealogies and silly myths and fables, but to just preach the word. In order to do that, he had to be a student of the Word. He encouraged him to give all diligence, to present himself as a worker that didn't need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. But now he closes out this second and final letter with some personal remarks, some personal encouragements, but all of them carry with them a note of sadness because of the finality of it. But even in the midst of that sadness, we're going to see tremendous faith and encouragement. He says in 2 Timothy 4, verse 6, after telling Timothy to fulfill his ministry, maybe with the hint that you're picking up the baton that I'm laying down. You, kind of like Elisha in the Old Testament, are now carrying the mantle of Elijah, his predecessor. So you fulfill your ministry because I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. Is he saying my ministry is over or almost over? Because I'm being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. You imagine the sadness of Timothy in reading those words. Paul sees his death as a departure, and he sees his death as a sacrifice. This idea of a drink offering, we're not as familiar with the drink offering as we are with some of the other offerings under the Old Covenant. When we think of an offering, we usually think of a bull or a lamb being slaughtered and offered on the altar of sacrifice. But a little bit of research tells us that there were other forms of offerings under the Old Testament, and one of those was a drink offering. And Paul says, as my life, notice the poetry of this, as my life is being poured out, it's being poured out as a drink offering. You can feel the exhaustion in Paul's language here. Of his life just being, he feels the life just being drained from him. And it makes him think of a drink offering. That's not just poetry. There's a metaphor there in the sense that I believe Paul is saying that his life is a sacrifice. Paul's not just dying of old age. He hasn't contracted some disease for which there's no cure and he's going to die. Paul is going to die because he's being put to death for his faith. And he said, I'm being poured out as a drink offering. The time of my departure is at hand. But with the sadness, there comes encouragement and hope. Because he wants Timothy to know, I fought the good fight, I finished the race, and I have kept the faith. the past tense of those verbs speak of the finality of his death that he says is at hand. But with that finality and the sadness that would accompany that, there's also encouragement, isn't there? I fought the good fight. I've finished the race. And most importantly, I have kept the faith. Surely Paul could look back in his life and see regrets. Chief on that list would have to have been the time of his life in which he persecuted Christianity. But yet he can look back on his life, a life that included the forgiveness that the blood of Christ offers, and say, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to meet my Maker because I fought that good fight, I have finished that race, and in doing so, I have kept the faith. It's important how we meet death. And Paul says, I'm ready because of my faith. I think what we see here is not just Paul's remarks about his own personal journey, but surely he is laying forth an example for Timothy and for us as well, and how we need to live our lives so that when the time of our departure is at hand, we can say the same thing. And so he says, finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. Playing on the idea of the fight and the race, he says there is a crown. The crown that he's talking about here is not the crown of royalty, but the crown that would be awarded to those who had won some athletic event, like a fight or a race. And so Paul says, since I fought the good fight and I have finished this race with faith, I'm going to receive my reward. And that reward is a crown of righteousness. Is that the crown that righteousness is rewarded with, or is that a crown that in itself is righteous? Or maybe it's a righteous crown because it is given by the Lord, who is the righteous judge, which the righteous judge will give to me on that day. Paul looked forward to that day. Is that day the day of his departure, or is this the day of judgment? Either way, Paul is saying, because I have lived my life in faith, I am looking forward to that crown of righteousness, which the righteous judge will give to me on that day. And again, I think we see that this isn't just Paul speaking of his personal journey, but teaching us a lesson as well because of this last phrase, and not to me only, but to also all who have loved his appearing. Paul says this isn't just a crown that's awarded to one victor. And so this race, this fight's a little different than most. In most races, only one person receives the crown. In most fights, only one person is the victor and receives the crown. But in this spiritual journey, this spiritual fight and race, many can be the victor. And Timothy, if you will do what I've told you to do in these last two letters, you can fight the good fight and finish the race when the time of your departure is at hand. And those words echo to us today. Are we the people who have fought the good fight and have kept the faith? And have we loved his appearing? Do we long for the coming of Christ? Do we long to be able to see him and to spend an eternity with he and our Father? Let Paul's example of his life of faith and his dying of faith be an encouragement for you to finish the race. Running a race is not about who starts the race. Anybody can start a marathon. But the crown is rewarded to those who finish the race. Make sure that you fight the good fight up to the time of your departure, so that you too, in loving the appearing of Jesus Christ as he comes again, that you too might receive a crown of righteousness.